behind the polished gates of Windsor Castle, where protocol reigns supreme and every gesture carries the weight of centuries, a single request would shatter the delicate balance of royal tradition. When Queen Camilla made what seemed like a simple demand regarding the late Queen Elizabeth's treasured Bentley State Limousine, she unknowingly triggered a confrontation that would expose the hidden tensions simmering beneath the crown's pristine surface. What happened next would force everyone involved to question where loyalty truly lies, with the living or with the memory of Britain's longest reigning monarch. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a shroud, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed fitting for the somber mood that had settled over the royal household. 3 months had passed since Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, yet her presence still lingered in every corridor, every room, and most notably in the pristine garage where her beloved vehicles remained untouched, preserved like sacred relics of a bygone era. Chief Security Officer James Whitmore adjusted his collar as he made his routine morning inspection of the royal fleet. At 58, James had dedicated over 3 decades of his life to protecting the royal family, earning their trust through unwavering loyalty and discretion. His weathered face bore the marks of countless sleepless nights, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, missing nothing that occurred within the castle walls. The garage housed an impressive collection of royal vehicles, each maintained to perfection by a dedicated team of mechanics and detailers. However, none commanded more respect than the Bentley State Limousine, a magnificent vehicle that had served as Queen Elizabeth's primary mode of transportation for state occasions. The deep royal blue exterior gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its chrome accents polished to mirror perfection. This wasn't merely a car. It was a symbol of the monarchy itself, carrying within its steel frame the dignity and grace of a woman who had served her nation for 70 years. James ran his hand along the vehicle's flawless surface, remembering the countless times he had escorted the late Queen to various engagements. She had always insisted on punctuality, treating each public appearance as a sacred duty to her people. The limousine had been her chariot, carrying her through decades of service with the same unwavering reliability she had shown her subjects. As he completed his inspection, the sound of footsteps echoed through the garage. James turned to see Queen Camilla approaching, accompanied by her private secretary, Margaret Thornberry. Camilla moved with the measured grace expected of someone in her position, though James noticed a certain tension in her bearing that hadn't been present during her earlier days as queen consort. "Good morning, Your Majesty," James said, offering a respectful bow. "I wasn't expecting anyone in the garage today." Camilla's smile was polite but distant. "Good morning, James. I wanted to discuss something with you regarding the vehicles." She paused, glancing around the impressive collection before her gaze settled on the Bentley State Limousine. "Specifically, I need to arrange for the Bentley to be prepared for use this afternoon." James felt a slight tightening in his chest. The vehicle hadn't been used since the Queen's final official engagement, and there had been an unspoken understanding among the staff that it would remain preserved as part of her legacy. "Certainly, Your Majesty. May I ask the occasion?" "My son Tom will be attending a charity gala in London this evening," Camilla replied, her tone matter of fact. "I believe the Bentley would be appropriate for such an occasion." The request struck James like a physical blow. Tom Parker Bowles, while certainly deserving of respect as the Queen's son, was not a working member of the royal family in the traditional sense. The idea of him using Queen Elizabeth's personal state vehicle seemed to violate every principle of royal protocol that James had spent decades upholding. "Your Majesty," James began carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a diplomat. "With the greatest respect, the Bentley State Limousine has traditionally been reserved for senior working members of the royal family during official state functions. Perhaps one of the other vehicles in the fleet would be more suitable for Mr. Parker Bowles' engagement." Camilla's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that spoke volumes about her reaction to being questioned. "James, I appreciate your attention to protocol, but I believe you may be overstepping your authority here. I am the Queen, and I am making a direct request regarding the use of a royal vehicle." Margaret Thornberry shifted uncomfortably beside her employer, clearly sensing the tension building between the two strong-willed individuals. As Camilla's private secretary, she had witnessed numerous instances where the new queen's desires had clashed with established royal traditions. But this seemed different somehow, more charged with emotional undercurrents. James stood his ground, his decades of military training evident in his posture. "Your Majesty, I understand your position, but my responsibility extends beyond simply following orders. I am charged with protecting not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the integrity of the institutions they represent." The late Queen Elizabeth specifically requested that certain protocols be maintained regarding her personal effects. "Are you suggesting that I don't have the authority to make decisions about royal property?" Camilla's voice carried a sharp edge that cut through the morning air. "Not at all, Your Majesty. I'm simply suggesting that there are established procedures for such requests, procedures that exist to honor the memory and wishes of your predecessor." The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of the castle's heating system. James could see the internal struggle playing out across Camilla's features as she weighed her options. She was caught between her desire to accommodate her son and the growing realization that her request had touched a nerve that ran deeper than simple protocol. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps we could explore alternative arrangements that would satisfy both parties?" But Camilla had already made her decision. "James, I want the Bentley prepared and ready for use by 3 o'clock this afternoon." "That's not a request. It's a direct order from your queen." James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. In all his years of service, he had never directly defied a member of the royal family. His loyalty was absolute, ingrained through decades of training and personal devotion. Yet something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong, as if allowing the limousine to be used for this purpose would somehow diminish the memory of the woman who had given her entire life to the crown. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "I need you to understand that my hesitation comes not from disrespect, but from a deep sense of duty to preserve the dignity of this institution." Queen Elizabeth treated that vehicle as more than mere transportation. It was a symbol of her commitment to the British people. Camilla's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Queen Elizabeth is gone, James. I am the queen now, and the decisions about how royal property is used are mine to make. I won't be questioned by staff, regardless of their length of service or personal feelings about my predecessor." The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing James to confront the new reality of his position. The woman he had served with unwavering dedication was indeed gone, replaced by someone whose vision of royal protocol differed significantly from what he had known. Yet his oath of service demanded loyalty to the crown, not to any individual who wore it. "I understand your position, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "However, I must respectfully request that you reconsider this decision. The optics alone could be damaging to the monarchy's reputation." Camilla's eyes flashed with anger. "The optics will be managed by the press office. What I need from you is compliance with my instructions. Will you prepare the vehicle, or do I need to find someone who will?" James stood at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but potentially the remainder of his career. He thought of Queen Elizabeth's gentle smile, her unwavering sense of duty, and the trust she had placed in him to protect the institution she held dear. Then he looked at Camilla, whose authority was unquestionable, but whose judgment in this matter seemed deeply flawed. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "I will need some time to consider your request and ensure that all proper protocols are followed." It wasn't a direct refusal, but it wasn't compliance either. James had bought himself time to navigate a situation that threatened to tear at the very fabric of his beliefs about duty, loyalty, and respect for tradition. Camilla studied his face for a long moment, recognizing the diplomatic nature of his response. "You have until noon to make your decision, James. After that, I'll assume you're unable to fulfill your duties and will need to be replaced." With that ultimatum hanging in the air, she turned and walked away, leaving James alone in the garage with the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on his shoulders. Second part, the clock in the castle's main corridor chimed 11 times as James Whitmore paced the length of his office, his mind racing through the implications of the morning's confrontation. His sanctuary, normally a place of order and calm efficiency, felt claustrophobic as he grappled with a decision that could end his distinguished career or compromise principles he had held sacred for over 3 decades. Through his window, he could see the bustling activity of the castle grounds as staff members went about their daily duties, blissfully unaware of the crisis brewing in their midst. James envied their simplicity of purpose, their clear-cut responsibilities that didn't require them to choose between competing loyalties. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, straightening his shoulders in an automatic gesture of military bearing. Deputy Security Chief Sarah Morrison entered, her expression grave. At 35, Sarah had worked under James for nearly a decade, rising through the ranks through a combination of sharp intelligence and unwavering integrity. She possessed an intuitive understanding of royal protocol that had made her an invaluable asset to the security team. "Sir, I heard about the situation with the Bentley," she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "The entire staff is talking about it." James sighed heavily. News travels fast in this place. "What exactly are they saying?" Sarah took a seat across from his desk, her posture professional, but her eyes reflecting genuine concern. "There's confusion, sir. Some believe you're being insubordinate, while others think you're protecting the Queen's legacy. The household is divided." "And what do you think, Sarah?" James asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think you're in an impossible position," she replied without hesitation. "Queen Camilla has every legal right to make this request, but emotionally, it feels wrong to everyone who served Queen Elizabeth. That limousine isn't just a vehicle. It's a symbol of everything she represented." James nodded, grateful for her candid assessment. "I've been going over the protocols all morning, trying to find some regulation or precedent that would support my position. The truth is, there's nothing written that explicitly prevents this use of the vehicle." "But there doesn't need to be," Sarah interjected. "Some things transcend written rules. They exist in the realm of respect, tradition, and understanding of what's appropriate." The conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time, it was Harold Pemberton, the castle's head butler, whose 40 years of service had made him a living repository of royal traditions and unwritten rules. Harold's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern as he entered the office. "Mr. Whitmore, forgive the intrusion, but I felt compelled to speak with you about the morning's events," Harold said, his formal tone barely concealing his emotional investment in the matter. "Please, Harold, sit down. I value your perspective on this situation." The elderly butler settled into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose body bore the accumulated strain of decades of dedicated service. "Sir, in all my years here, I've never witnessed such a direct challenge to established protocols. The staff is understandably upset." "How upset?" James asked, dreading the answer. "Cook Mrs. Henderson was in tears this morning," Harold replied. "She said it felt like watching someone desecrate a shrine. The maintenance staff who cared for that vehicle are equally distressed. They see it as a betrayal of everything Queen Elizabeth stood for." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Harold's right, sir. The emotional impact on the staff can't be ignored. These people dedicated their lives to serving Queen Elizabeth, and they're still grieving her loss. This feels like salt in their wounds." James felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on his shoulders. His decision wouldn't just affect him. It would reverberate throughout the entire royal household, potentially damaging morale and undermining the sense of continuity that was so crucial during this period of transition. "Have either of you spoken with anyone from Queen Camilla's staff?" James asked. Harold nodded grimly. "I had a brief conversation with Mrs. Thornberry. She seems uncomfortable with the situation, but feels obligated to support her employer's decision. She did mention that this request came directly from Tom Parker Bowles himself." This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. If Tom had specifically requested the use of the Bentley, it suggested a level of entitlement that many would find inappropriate, regardless of his relationship to the Queen. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression growing more determined. "Sir, what if we presented alternative options that would satisfy everyone involved? The Rolls-Royce Phantom is equally impressive and doesn't carry the same emotional significance as the Bentley." "I suggested alternatives this morning," James replied. Queen Camilla was very clear that she specifically wanted the Bentley. This isn't about practicality, it's about making a statement. The three sat in contemplative silence for several moments, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of the situation. Finally, Harold spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of his years of experience. "Mr. Whitmore, may I share something that Queen Elizabeth once told me? It was during the early days of her reign, when she was still learning to navigate the complex balance between personal desires and public duty." James nodded, eager to hear any wisdom that might guide his decision. "She said that the crown doesn't belong to the person who wears it. It belongs to the people, and every decision made while wearing it should reflect that understanding. She believed that every choice, no matter how small, sent a message about the values and priorities of the monarchy." The butler's words struck James with the force of revelation. This wasn't simply about a car, or even about following orders. It was about the fundamental question of what the monarchy represented and how its symbols should be treated. Sarah stood up abruptly, her face flushed with sudden inspiration. "What if we documented everything? If Queen Camilla insists on proceeding, we make sure there's a clear record of the objections raised and the reasons behind them. History will judge whether this was the right decision." James considered this approach. Creating a formal record would protect him professionally while also preserving the concerns of those who felt the request was inappropriate. It was a compromise that satisfied neither his conscience nor his sense of duty, but it might be the best available option in an impossible situation. "There's something else to consider," Harold added quietly. "The press. If this story leaks, and it inevitably will, how will it be perceived by the public?" Queen Elizabeth's popularity was built on her sense of propriety and respect for tradition. Any action that seems to contradict those values could damage the monarchy's reputation. The trio continued their discussion for another hour, exploring every possible angle and consequence of the decision James faced. As noon approached, the weight of the ultimatum grew heavier, and the clarity he sought remained elusive. Finally, Sarah posed a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Sir, what do you think Queen Elizabeth would want you to do?" James closed his eyes, picturing the late Queen's serene face and remembering her unwavering commitment to duty above all else. He thought of her final months, when she had continued to fulfill her obligations despite her failing health, driven by an unshakable sense of responsibility to her people and her office. When he opened his eyes, his resolve had crystallized. The answer wasn't found in protocols or regulations, but in the example set by a woman who had never put personal convenience above public duty. "I know what I have to do," he said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that surprised even him. Third part, the grandfather clock in the Queen's private sitting room marked 12:15 as James Whitmore stood outside the ornate double doors, steeling himself for a conversation that would likely define the remainder of his career. In his hand, he carried a leather portfolio containing documentation he hoped he wouldn't need to use, but which represented his final insurance against the storm he was about to unleash. Margaret Thornberry opened the door with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her expression was carefully neutral, but James detected a hint of sympathy in her eyes that suggested she understood the impossible position he faced. "Her Majesty is expecting you," Margaret said softly, stepping aside to allow him entry into the elegantly appointed room where Queen Camilla waited. Camilla sat behind an antique writing desk, her posture erect and commanding despite the informal setting. She had changed from her morning attire into a sophisticated burgundy suit that accentuated her royal bearing. The transformation was subtle but significant, reminding James that he was about to confront not just a woman making an unreasonable request, but the Queen of England exercising her sovereign authority. "James," she said without looking up from the document she was reviewing, "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my request and prepare the vehicle accordingly." The dismissive tone stung, but James had anticipated this approach. He had spent the past hour preparing not just his words, but his emotional responses to the various ways this conversation might unfold. "Your Majesty, I have given your request considerable thought, and I've consulted with relevant staff members about the implications and procedures involved," James began, maintaining the formal tone appropriate for such a serious discussion. Camilla finally looked up, her eyes sharp and assessing. "And I cannot, in good conscience, authorize the use of the Bentley State Limousine for this purpose," James said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. "I respectfully decline to follow your order." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret Thornberry's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room as the full implications of James's statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. Camilla set down her pen with deliberate precision, her movements controlled but radiating barely contained anger. "I beg your pardon? Did you just refuse a direct order from your queen?" "I did, Your Majesty, and I take full responsibility for that decision," James replied, opening his portfolio and removing a formal letter he had spent the past hour crafting. "I am hereby submitting my resignation, effective immediately, along with a detailed explanation of the circumstances that led to this decision." Camilla's composure cracked slightly, revealing surprise beneath her royal mask. She had clearly expected capitulation, not outright defiance followed by resignation. The letter in James's hand represented something she hadn't anticipated, a principled stand that would create exactly the kind of documentation and publicity she had hoped to avoid. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You're willing to end a distinguished career over a car?" James placed the letter on her desk with ceremonial gravity. "Your Majesty, this was never about a car. This is about the fundamental principles that guide the monarchy and the respect owed to the memory of a woman who dedicated her entire life to the service of this nation." Margaret stepped forward slightly, perhaps sensing an opportunity to mediate before the situation spiraled completely out of control. "Perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements." But Camilla raised a hand to silence her secretary, her attention focused entirely on the man who had just challenged her authority in the most public way possible. The resignation letter sat between them like a declaration of war, its formal language belying the emotional earthquake it represented. "James, you're making a terrible mistake," Camilla said, her tone shifting from anger to something approaching conciliation. "I understand your loyalty to my predecessor, but you must recognize that the monarchy has to evolve. We cannot remain frozen in amber, preserving every tradition simply because that's how things were done before." For the first time since entering the room, James allowed himself a slight smile. "Your Majesty, evolution and preservation are not mutually exclusive." Queen Elizabeth understood that better than anyone. She modernized the monarchy while maintaining its essential dignity and the respect of the British people. The comparison was deliberate and stinging. James was essentially arguing that Camilla lacked the wisdom and judgment that had made her predecessor so beloved, and everyone in the room understood the implication. "How dare you lecture me about Queen Elizabeth?" Camilla snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "You seem to forget that I lived with her, worked alongside her, and learned from her for years. I don't need lessons from a security guard about what she would have wanted." The dismissive reference to his position as a security guard revealed more about Camilla's true feelings than she perhaps intended. James had always been treated as a valued advisor by Queen Elizabeth, someone whose opinions were sought and respected. This casual diminishment of his role spoke volumes about the different leadership style he would be leaving behind. "You're absolutely right, Your Majesty," James replied calmly. "You knew her personally in ways that I never could. But I had the privilege of watching her public service for over 30 years, and I learned something crucial about leadership from observing her. True authority doesn't require the assertion of power over others. It comes from the willingness to place duty above personal desire. Margaret winced visibly at the implicit criticism in James's words. The conversation had moved far beyond the original dispute about the limousine and into dangerous territory that challenged Camilla's fundamental approach to her role as queen. Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. I think this conversation has gone quite far enough. Your resignation is accepted, effective immediately. You'll have your personal effects removed from the premises by the end of the day. James bowed formally, a gesture that carried more dignity than deference. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll ensure a smooth transition of my responsibilities to Deputy Chief Morrison. As he turned to leave, Camilla's voice stopped him at the door. James, I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry it came to this. You've served this family with distinction, and you deserve better. He turned back to face her, seeing for the first time not the imperious queen who had challenged him, but a woman struggling with the enormous weight of expectations and traditions she felt compelled to modify. Your Majesty, I believe you genuinely want what's best for the monarchy. We simply disagree about what that means, he replied with unexpected gentleness. I hope time will prove one of us right. As James left the sitting room for the final time, he could hear Margaret's quiet voice beginning what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation about damage control and public relations. The story would leak, probably within hours, and the royal family would face scrutiny about their judgment and sensitivity during a still tender period of mourning. Walking through the corridors that had been his second home for 3 decades, James felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. He had made the choice his conscience demanded, but the cost had been higher than he had initially imagined. The staff members he passed looked at him with expressions ranging from admiration to concern, understanding that his departure marked the end of an era in more ways than one. In his office, he found Sarah Morrison waiting with a cup of tea and the kind of warm smile that reminded him why he had chosen her as his successor. "Well, sir, how did it go?" she asked, though his expression had already provided most of the answer. "I'm done, Sarah. The position is yours now, along with all the impossible decisions that come with it." She nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility that had just been transferred to her shoulders. "What about the limousine?" James looked out the window toward the garage where the Bentley State Limousine waited, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon of lost traditions. "That decision belongs to someone else now," he said quietly. Fourth part, the news of James Whitmore's resignation spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire, creating ripples of shock and discussion that reached every corner of the royal household. By 3 o'clock, the same time the Bentley State Limousine had been scheduled for preparation, staff members were huddled in small groups throughout the castle, their conversations hushed but intense as they processed the implications of what had just transpired. Sarah Morrison found herself thrust into the role of chief security officer under circumstances she had never imagined possible. At barely past noon on her first day in charge, she faced the same impossible decision that had cost her mentor his career. Queen Camilla's order regarding the limousine remained in effect, and the responsibility for implementation now fell squarely on her shoulders. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that the vehicle at the center of the controversy sat unused in the garage, while the entire royal household grappled with questions about authority, tradition, and appropriate behavior during a period of transition. Tom Parker Bowles would ultimately attend his charity gala using one of the other vehicles in the royal fleet, but the damage to relationships and morale had already been done. Harold Pemberton made his way through the castle's service corridors with uncharacteristic haste, his normal measured pace abandoned in favor of urgent movement. As head butler, he had witnessed decades of royal dramas, but few had affected him as personally as this morning's events. The staff members he encountered along the way looked to him for guidance and reassurance, understanding that his long tenure had made him a kind of institutional memory for proper protocol and behavior. In the servants' hall, cook Mrs. Henderson sat at the large wooden table where meals were planned and kitchen gossip traditionally shared. Her eyes were red-rimmed from tears she had shed earlier, and her usually bustling demeanor had been replaced by a quiet melancholy that spoke volumes about her emotional investment in the morning's events. 43 years I've been in this kitchen, she said to no one in particular as Harold entered the room. 43 years of watching that dear woman put duty before everything else. And now this. Harold sat down beside her, his formal bearing softened by genuine compassion for his colleague's distress. Martha, we must remember that the monarchy will survive this, just as it has survived countless other challenges. Our Queen Elizabeth taught us that resilience and dignity in the face of adversity are what define this institution. But what about Mr. Whitmore? Asked young Emily, a recently hired housemaid whose admiration for the departing security chief was evident in her voice. He stood up for what was right, and now his career is over. The question hung in the air, highlighting the moral complexity of the situation. James had indeed stood up for principles he held dear, but he had also defied direct orders from the monarch in a way that challenged the very foundation of royal authority. Meanwhile, in the Queen's private quarters, a very different conversation was taking place. Margaret Thornberry had spent the past hour working with the Royal Communications team to develop a strategy for handling the inevitable media attention that would follow news of James's resignation. The challenge was enormous. How to present the situation in a way that didn't make Queen Camilla appear callous or insensitive while avoiding any suggestion that her authority had been successfully challenged by a member of staff. The story will break by tomorrow morning at the latest, warned Press Secretary David Hartwell, his normally confident demeanor showing cracks of concern. The palace staff isn't known for its discretion when they feel strongly about something, and they clearly feel very strongly about this. Camilla sat in her favorite armchair, her earlier anger replaced by a weary resignation to the political reality of her situation. The limousine request that had seemed so reasonable in the morning now appeared to have been a catastrophic miscalculation that had cost her the loyalty of long-serving staff members and potentially damaged her public image. "What are our options?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be unsatisfying. Margaret consulted her notes before responding. "We can frame this as a personnel matter involving insubordination, which protects your authority but makes you appear harsh toward a respected employee. Alternatively, we can emphasize Mr. Whitmore's long service and present his departure as a natural transition, but that suggests the resignation was amicable when clearly it was not." The complexity of the situation reflected deeper issues about Camilla's position within the monarchy. Unlike her husband, who had been born to his role and had spent decades preparing for kingship, she had entered the royal family as an outsider and still faced skepticism from both staff and public about her legitimacy and judgment. David cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, there's a third option we should consider. If we were to acknowledge that the request about the limousine was reconsidered and ultimately withdrawn, it might demonstrate wisdom and sensitivity to public feeling." The suggestion was essentially asking Camilla to admit she had been wrong, something that went against every instinct she had developed about royal authority and dignity. Yet the alternative seemed to be prolonged negative publicity and continued tension within the household. Back in the garage, the Bentley State limousine remained untouched, its presence now carrying a weight far beyond its considerable physical mass. The vehicle that had once represented the dignity and continuity of the monarchy had become a symbol of the tensions and uncertainties facing the institution during its period of transition. Sarah Morrison stood before the magnificent car, understanding that whatever decision she made about preparing it for use would be scrutinized and judged by everyone from fellow staff members to the British public. The burden of choice that had fallen to her was even heavier than what James had faced, because her decision would be seen as either validating his principled stand or repudiating it entirely. The sound of approaching footsteps caused her to turn, revealing Queen Camilla walking toward her with measured steps. The Queen's expression was unreadable, but her presence in the garage was significant in itself, suggesting that she had come to address the situation personally rather than through intermediaries. "Sarah," the Queen began, using her first name in a gesture that acknowledged their shared humanity beneath the formal hierarchy. "I understand that you're facing the same difficult decision that Mr. Whitmore struggled with this morning." Sarah straightened to attention, but maintained eye contact, demonstrating the respectful confidence that had earned her promotion. "Yes, Your Majesty. I've been considering all the factors involved. I want you to know that I've been doing the same," Camilla replied, her voice carrying a note of reflection that hadn't been present during the morning's confrontation. Sometimes the wisdom of a decision only becomes clear when we see its full consequences. The admission was subtle, but significant, suggesting that the Queen had come to regret at least some aspects of her handling of the situation. Sarah waited respectfully for her to continue, understanding that this moment would likely determine not just the fate of the Limousine request, but the future tone of their working relationship. "I've decided to withdraw my request regarding the Bentley," Camilla said finally. "Mr. Parker Bowles will use alternative transportation for his engagement this evening. The state limousine will remain available only for official royal duties, as it was during my predecessor's reign." The relief in Sarah's expression was immediate and unmistakable. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I believe this decision honors both your authority and the traditions that have served the monarchy well." Camilla nodded slowly, her gaze moving to the vehicle that had caused so much turmoil. "I also want you to know that while I accepted Mr. Whitmore's resignation, I hold no ill will toward him. He acted according to his conscience, and that deserves respect even when it creates difficulties." As the Queen turned to leave, Sarah called after her. "Your Majesty, will there be any announcement about the change in plans?" "I'll leave that to the press office to handle appropriately," Camilla replied. "What matters now is moving forward in a way that unites rather than divides us." In the hours that followed, word of the Queen's decision spread through the castle with the same speed that had carried news of the original controversy. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive, with staff members expressing both relief and renewed respect for their monarch's wisdom in reconsidering her position. James Whitmore, clearing out his office with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire career, received the news with quiet satisfaction rather than celebration. His principled stand had come at a significant personal cost, but it had ultimately achieved its intended purpose of preserving the dignity and appropriate use of Queen Elizabeth's cherished vehicle. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, the Bentley State Limousine remained in its honored place in the royal garage, its polished surface reflecting the setting sun like a beacon of preserved tradition. The crisis had passed, but its lessons would linger long in the memory of everyone involved, serving as a reminder that true leadership sometimes requires the wisdom to step back from positions of power rather than asserting them at all costs. The monarchy had survived another test of its values and traditions, emerging perhaps stronger for having weathered the storm while maintaining the delicate balance between authority and accountability that had sustained it through centuries of change. In the end, the real victory belonged not to any individual, but to the institution itself and the principles that continued to guide it through times of uncertainty and transition.